The restaurant was softly lit, the kind of place that tried to make disappointment feel elegant. Warm amber lamps reflected off polished wood, and low music hummed beneath conversations meant to sound effortless. Aaliyah Brooks sat perfectly still at a small table near the window, her hands folded around a water glass she hadn't touched. She was 30, a black woman with deep brown skin, natural curls falling neatly over her shoulders, wearing a navy blue wrap dress she'd chosen carefully. Professional, confident, hopeful without trying too hard. She had arrived 10 minutes early. He had arrived late. And now, he was standing. "I just don't feel the spark," her blind date said, already reaching for his jacket. "You're great. Just not what I expected." Aaliyah nodded once, calmly, even kindly. Of course. He didn't offer to pay. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't even wait for a response before walking away, chair scraping loudly against the floor. The silence he left behind was heavier than the rejection itself. Welcome to Korean Mafia lovers. Before we dive into this incredible story of unexpected connections, comment where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more amazing romance stories like this one. Kalaya exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together as if to keep something fragile from breaking loose. She reached for her phone, pretending she had somewhere else to be, someone else waiting. Anything but the truth. That being dismissed so casually still hurt more than she liked to admit. At the table beside hers, a man had watched everything. Han Min-jae sat alone, a glass of untouched whiskey in front of him. 34, Korean, devastatingly composed. His tailored black suit fit his muscular frame with surgical precision, white shirt open at the collar, revealing the edge of an intricate dragon tattoo along his collarbone. His face was sharp, controlled, but his eyes weren't cold. They were thoughtful. He wasn't supposed to be there long. Dinner meetings bored him. People lied too easily over food. But something about the woman beside him, the way she accepted humiliation with dignity instead of desperation, had anchored his attention. Min-jae had built an empire on reading people, knowing when they were weak, when they were lying, when they were dangerous. But this woman, she wasn't performing. She wasn't calculating her next move or plotting revenge. She was simply processing. With grace he rarely witnessed in his world. The man who'd just left had been everything Min-jae despised, entitled, shallow, cruel, without purpose. He'd watched the entire interaction unfold, seen the way the man had dismissed her before she'd even finished speaking, the way he'd looked at her like she was a disappointing purchase he wanted to return. Min-jae had dealt with men like that before. In his world, disrespect had consequences. But this wasn't his world. This was a restaurant where normal people came for normal dates, where the worst thing that happened was awkward conversation and split checks, where women like Aaliyah, he'd heard her name when she'd introduced herself, came hoping for connection and left with wounded pride. He waited until the man was gone. Then he waited a moment longer, watching as she stared at her phone screen without really seeing it, her shoulders set in a way that spoke of practiced resilience. Finally, Min-jae turned slightly in his chair, not intruding, not looming. "May I ask you one question?" he said. Aaliyah looked up, startled. Her instinct was to retreat, to protect what little pride she had left. But his tone wasn't invasive. It was gentle, curious. And there was something in his eyes, not pity, but recognition. "Okay," she said cautiously. Min-jae met her eyes, steady and sincere. "Did he ever ask you who you are, or only what you looked like across a table?" The question landed softly and devastatingly. Aaliyah blinked. Her throat tightened. "He asked what I did for work," she said quietly, "and if I always wore my hair like this." The memory stung. The way he'd said it, like her natural curls, were somehow unprofessional, inappropriate for a woman her age. Like she should apologize for not conforming to whatever image he'd constructed in his mind. Min-jae nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. "Then he didn't reject you," he said. "He disqualified himself." Aaliyah let out a quiet, surprised laugh, half relief, half disbelief. "That's a generous way to see it." "No," Min-jae replied. "It's an accurate one." She studied him now, not just his face but his posture, relaxed, controlled, not performing. There was something magnetic about his stillness, the way he seemed completely present in the moment. His accent was subtle, cultured. His hands, she noticed, were elegant but strong, with small scars across the knuckles that spoke of a life more complicated than his expensive suit suggested. "And what do you see?" she asked. He paused, choosing honesty over charm. Someone who stayed kind when she had every reason not to. Aaliyah felt something loosen in her chest. When was the last time someone had noticed her kindness instead of cataloguing her flaws? When had someone seen her grace under pressure, as strength rather than weakness? "I'm Aaliyah," she said, extending her hand. "Min-jae," he replied, taking her hand gently. His touch was warm, careful, like he understood the weight of the moment. They talked, slowly at first, about nothing important. Food preferences, the neighborhood, the way the city felt too loud some nights. Min-jae didn't dominate the conversation. He listened, asked thoughtful questions, remembered her answers. "You work in marketing?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Brand strategy for a non-profit," Aaliyah explained. "We help small businesses in underserved communities build their presence. It's not glamorous, but it matters." "Matters more than glamorous," Min-jae said. "What drew you to it?" The question caught her off guard. Most people asked about her salary or advancement opportunities. "My grandmother owned a corner store in Detroit," she said. "Worked there 60 years. Never had the tools to really grow it, you know. I wanted to be those tools for other people." Min-jae's expression shifted, something deeper, more personal. "Family legacy is powerful." "What about you?" Aaliyah asked. "What do you do?" "Business," Min-jae said simply. "Import, export, nothing as meaningful as your work." It wasn't entirely a lie. His legitimate businesses did involve import and export, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and the omission sat heavy in his chest. She didn't know who he was. Not really. She only knew he didn't make her feel small. When the server came, Min-jae quietly paid for her untouched dinner and his drink. No announcement. No expectation. "You didn't have to," Aaliyah began. "I wanted to," he said simply. Outside, the night air was cool, forgiving. They stood on the sidewalk beneath the glow of streetlights, neither quite ready to end the unexpected encounter. "Thank you," Aaliyah said. "For the question." Min-jae inclined his head. "Thank you for answering." They exchanged numbers, no promises, but as Aaliyah walked to her car, she found herself smiling for the first time all evening. Min-jae watched her go, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. In his world, connections were transactions. Trust was currency. But this woman, she had offered him something rarer than either. She had offered him honesty, and for the first time in years, Min-jae wanted to be worthy of it. 3 days later, Min-jae texted, "Coffee? I know a place that doesn't serve disappointment." Aaliyah stared at her phone, surprised by how quickly she smiled. "Is that a guarantee?" Money-back promise. They met at a small cafe in Koreatown, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. Min-jae arrived first, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines to all exits, a habit so ingrained he didn't realize he was doing it. Aaliyah walked in wearing jeans and a cream sweater, her hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She looked relaxed, genuine, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with performance. "No disappointment so far," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "The day is young," Min-jae replied, but he was smiling. They ordered, her a lavender latte, him black coffee. The conversation flowed easier this time, built on the foundation they'd established 3 nights ago. "Tell me something you've never told anyone on a second date," Aaliyah said, stirring her latte. Min-jae considered this. In his world, secrets were weapons. But sitting across from her, he found himself wanting to offer something real. "I collect vintage vinyl records, yeah," he said. "Jazz mostly. Miles Davis, John Coltrane. I have a room in my apartment that's just music." "That's beautiful," Aaliyah said, and she meant it. "What got you into jazz?" "My grandfather," Min-jae said, his voice softening. "He was a musician before life got complicated. He used to say music was the only honest language." Was he right? "I'm starting to think so." Aaliyah leaned forward slightly. "Your turn. Ask me something." "What's the bravest thing you've ever done?" The question surprised her. Most people asked about hobbies or travel. "I testified against my college roommate's abusive boyfriend," she said quietly. "In court." She was too scared, but someone had to speak for her. Min-jae's respect for her deepened visibly. "That took courage." "It took anger," Aaliyah corrected. "Courage came later, when I had to live with the consequences. He had friends. They made things difficult for a while." Something cold flickered in Min-jae's eyes, protective, dangerous, but his voice remained gentle. "You stood up anyway. Someone had to." They talked for 2 hours, about books, about family, about the way the city changed depending on where you stood. Min-jae found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, not the sanitized versions he used for business, but real memories. His grandfather teaching him to play piano, the weight of expectations he'd carried since childhood, the loneliness that came with power. Aaliyah listened without judgment, asked questions that showed she was truly hearing him. She told him about her work, about the small business owners she helped, about the satisfaction of watching someone's dream take shape. She spoke about her family, parents who'd worked 2 jobs each to send her to college, a sister who taught elementary school in Portland, nieces who called her every Sunday. When they left the cafe, Min-jae walked her to her car. The afternoon had stretched into evening without either of them noticing. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "I'd like that too," Aaliyah replied. This time, when they parted, there was anticipation instead of uncertainty. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Dinner at a small Ethiopian restaurant, where Aaliyah taught him to eat with injera bread, laughing when he struggled with the technique. A jazz club, where Min-jae introduced her to live Coltrane, watching her face light up as the music washed over her. Long walks through different neighborhoods, conversations that stretched into comfortable silences. Min-jae was careful. He kept his phone on silent during their dates, handled business before and after, never let his 2 worlds collide. Aaliyah was becoming something precious, something separate from the empire he'd inherited. But secrets have weight, and weight, eventually, demands acknowledgement. It was during their 4th date that Aaliyah first noticed the inconsistencies. They were walking through Central Park when Min-jae's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his entire demeanor shifted. Subtle, but she caught it. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes scanned their surroundings with sudden alertness. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Work call," he said, declining it. "Nothing that can't wait." But she'd seen the caller ID, Sophia, and the text preview. "Situation developing. Need you—" "Sophia?" Aaliyah asked casually. "Colleague?" "Something like that," Min-jae replied, and she heard the evasion in his voice. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Aaliyah found herself thinking about the small things, the way people deferred to Min-jae wherever they went. Not just polite respect, but something deeper, more careful. The expensive clothes that fit too perfectly, the watch that probably cost more than her car. The way he always seemed to know exactly where the exits were, how he positioned himself to see the entire room. She'd dated successful men before. This felt different. But when he texted her the next morning, "Good morning, beautiful," thinking about your laugh, she pushed the doubts aside. Whatever Min-jae was hiding, it couldn't be worse than the loneliness she'd felt before meeting him. She was wrong. It was Lucas, his lieutenant, who forced the issue. "You're distracted," Lucas said during a meeting about territorial disputes. "This woman is not your concern," Min-jae cut him off. "She could be a liability," Lucas pressed. "If our enemies, then we make sure she never becomes a target," Min-jae said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions. But Lucas's words planted a seed of worry. Min-jae had enemies, people who would use anything, anyone, to hurt him. The thought of Aaliyah being pulled into that darkness made his chest tight with protective fury. That night, he almost cancelled their date. Instead, he showed up at her apartment with takeout from her favorite Thai place, determined to memorize every detail of her smile before he had to make an impossible choice. "You seem different tonight," Aaliyah observed as they sat on her couch, containers of pad thai between them. "Different how?" "Distant. Like you're somewhere else." Min-jae met her eyes, seeing the concern there, the growing trust. "Just work stress." It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. And for the first time since he'd met her, Min-jae felt the weight of what he was hiding. The call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Min-jae's phone buzzed against his nightstand, pulling him from dreams of jazz clubs and Aaliyah's laugh. The caller ID made him instantly alert. Sophia, his head of security. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "Renee Kim is making moves. She knows about the woman." Min-jae sat up, ice flooding his veins. Renee Kim, former ally turned bitter enemy after a business deal went south. She was ruthless, calculating, and had a particular talent for finding pressure points. What kind of moves? Photos. Someone's been watching her apartment, her work. Renee's building a file. The protective fury that rose in Min-jae's chest was immediate and consuming. Double her security detail. Invisible, but comprehensive. Already done. But Min-jae, you need to tell her. If this escalates, it won't escalate, Min-jae said, his voice carrying deadly certainty. "I'll handle Renee." But as he hung up, Min-jae knew the choice he'd been dreading was no longer theoretical. Aaliyah was in danger because of him, because he'd been selfish enough to want something pure in his complicated world. The next morning, he sat in his office, staring at surveillance photos Sophia had intercepted. Images of Aaliyah leaving her building, walking to work, meeting friends for lunch. Someone had been watching her for days, cataloguing her routines, her vulnerabilities. His hands clenched into fists. In his world, this kind of surveillance was a prelude to action. Renee wasn't just gathering information, she was preparing to strike. "Sir?" Lucas appeared in the doorway. "The Kim situation is my priority," Min-jae finished. "Cancel everything else." "And the woman." Min-jae's eyes were cold as winter. "She's under our protection now. Anyone who touches her answers to me personally." That evening, they had dinner plans. Min-jae arrived at the restaurant early, choosing a table with perfect sight lines, his security team positioned discreetly throughout the space. When Aaliyah walked in, beautiful in a burgundy dress that made her skin glow, his heart clenched with the knowledge that this might be their last normal moment. "You're early," she said, sliding into her seat. "Wanted to make sure we got a good table," Min-jae replied, but his eyes were scanning the room, cataloguing faces, exits, potential threats. Aaliyah noticed. She always noticed. "Okay, what's going on?" she asked directly. "You've been different for days, distracted. And don't say work stress. I know what work stress looks like, and this isn't it." Min-jae met her eyes, seeing the intelligence there, the growing suspicion. Aaliyah wasn't naive. She was observant, intuitive. She'd been picking up on the inconsistencies in his story, the way conversations stopped when he answered his phone, the deference people showed him that went beyond normal respect. "There are things about my life," Minjae began carefully, that are complicated. Complicated how? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. Renee's here. East entrance. 3 men with her. Minjae's blood turned to ice. His eyes found Sophia across the room, saw her subtle nod toward the entrance. Renee Kim stood there, elegant, dangerous, scanning the room with predatory focus. Their eyes met across the restaurant. Renee smiled, cold and triumphant, then began walking toward their table. Minjae? Aaliyah's voice was sharp with concern. What's wrong? We need to leave, Minjae said, standing abruptly. Right now. But it was too late. Renee had reached their table, her smile sharp as a blade. Minjae, she said pleasantly, how lovely to see you, and you must be Aaliyah. Aaliyah looked between them, confusion and alarm growing in her eyes. I'm sorry. Do we know each other? Not yet, Renee said, her tone deceptively warm. But I know quite a bit about you. Your work with Community Growth Partners, your apartment on Maple Street, your morning coffee routine at that little place near your office. The blood drained from Aaliyah's face. How do you, Renee? Minjae's voice was deadly quiet. Walk away. Oh, but I'm just getting started, Renee replied. Aaliyah, dear, has Minjae told you what he really does for a living? Because import-export is such a quaint way to describe running the largest Korean crime syndicate on the East Coast. The words hit Aaliyah like physical blows. She looked at Minjae, searching his face for denial, for explanation, found only grim confirmation. Crime syndicate? She whispered. Such an ugly term, Renee continued. I prefer family business. Though I suppose the drugs, the money laundering, the occasional murder, those do tend to complicate the semantics. Enough. Minjae stepped between them, his presence suddenly radiating the kind of controlled violence that made grown men step back. But Renee wasn't intimidated. She deserves to know who she's sleeping with, don't you think? What kind of blood pays for those expensive dinners? How many people have died to build the empire that bought that pretty dress she's wearing? Aaliyah stood slowly, her face pale, but her voice steady. I think I should go. Aaliyah, wait. Minjae reached for her, but she stepped back. Don't, she said quietly. Just don't. She walked away with dignity and tact, but Minjae could see the tremor in her hands, the way she held herself too carefully upright. Renee watched her go with satisfaction. Such a shame, she said. She seemed lovely. I do hope nothing happens to her. The threat was clear. Minjae turned to face Renee fully, and for a moment she saw exactly who he really was beneath the careful civility. Her smile faltered. If you touch her, Minjae said, his voice barely above a whisper. If you even think about her, I will end you. Not your business, not your territory, you personally. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Renee's confidence cracked slightly. She'd forgotten, perhaps, that Minjae's reputation for ruthlessness wasn't just inherited. It was earned. This isn't over, she said, but she was already backing away. Yes, Minjae replied. It is. As Renee left, Minjae stood alone in the restaurant, surrounded by the wreckage of the best thing that had ever happened to him. He'd known this moment would come. He'd just hoped, foolishly, that he could find a way to keep both his world and his heart intact. Now he had to choose between protecting Aaliyah and losing her forever. The choice, he realized, had already been made. Aaliyah didn't answer his calls. For 3 days, Minjae tried. Texts, voicemails, even showing up at her office only to be told she was unavailable. He understood. She needed space to process what Renee had revealed, to decide if she could trust him enough to hear his side. But understanding didn't make the silence easier to bear. On Thursday morning, Daniel, her co-worker and friend, called him. She knows, Daniel said without preamble. About you, about what you really do. Minjae's grip tightened on his phone. How much? Enough. Look, I don't know what your game is, but Aaliyah is good people. She doesn't deserve to be collateral damage in whatever. I would never hurt her, Minjay interrupted. Maybe not intentionally, but your world. It hurts people just by existing. The words hit like physical blows because they were true. Minjay had spent years insulating himself from that truth, but Aaliyah had stripped away his defenses, made him feel the weight of every choice he'd made. Tell me where she is, Minjay said. No. Daniel. She's scared, man. Not of you exactly, but of what being with you means, and honestly, she should be. The line went dead. That evening, Minjay sat in his apartment, surrounded by his grandfather's vinyl collection. He put on Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, and let the music fill the silence Aaliyah had left behind. His grandfather had built the organization as protection. Korean immigrants in the 1960s couldn't rely on police, couldn't trust the system to defend them, so they defended themselves. Over the decades, protection had become power, power had become corruption, and corruption had become the very thing they'd originally fought against. Minjay had inherited that legacy at 25, when his father died suddenly. He could have walked away, let the organization crumble, but that would have meant war, other groups moving in, violence in the streets, innocent people caught in the crossfire. So he'd stayed, and slowly, carefully, he'd been changing things, moving money into legitimate businesses, cutting ties with the worst elements, building something that could exist in the light instead of the shadows. But change took time, and time, apparently, was something he no longer had. His phone rang. Lucas. Renee's escalating, his lieutenant reported. She's reached out to the Kozlov brothers, trying to form an alliance. They're interested. The Kozlovs were brutal, unpredictable. If they joined forces with Renee, it wouldn't just be business, it would be war. What do they want? Minjay asked. Territory, respect, and they want you to know that your personal attachments make you vulnerable. Minjay closed his eyes. Set up a meeting. With Renee, with everyone. It's time to end this. But first he had one more call to make. Mark answered on the second ring. If this is about Aaliyah, it's about keeping her safe, Minjay said. There's going to be a confrontation. People who want to hurt me might try to use her. I need to know she's protected. Protected how? I'm sending Sophia. She'll coordinate with building security. Make sure Aaliyah gets to and from work safely. Invisible protection, but comprehensive. Mark was quiet for a long moment. You really care about her. More than I've ever cared about anything. Then why don't you just walk away, leave this life behind? Because walking away doesn't make the enemies disappear. It just makes me powerless to protect the people I love. The word hung in the air between them. Love. Minjay hadn't said it to Aaliyah, had barely admitted it to himself, but it was true, undeniable, and terrifying. She's at her sister's place, Mark said finally. In Portland. She flew out this morning. Relief and panic warred in Minjay's chest. She was safe, but she was running. From him, from them. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet. Fix this mess. Prove you're worth the risk. The meeting was set for midnight at the docks. Neutral territory, minimal witnesses. Minjay arrived with Sophia and 2 other trusted lieutenants. Renee came with the Kozlov brothers and enough firepower to level a city block. Minjay, Renee said, her voice carrying across the empty warehouse. So good of you to come. Let's skip the pleasantries, Minjay replied. What do you want? Your territory, your contacts, your complete withdrawal from the East Coast operations. And, in return, your girlfriend stays breathing. The threat was explicit now, out in the open. Minjay felt the familiar cold fury settle over him, but this time it was different. This time, it was personal. Aaliyah Brooks is off limits, he said. Non-negotiable. Victor Kozlov, the elder brother, laughed, a sound like grinding metal. You think you can make demands? You're outnumbered, outgunned. Am I? Min-jae's phone buzzed once. Then the warehouse lights went out. In the darkness, chaos erupted. Shouts, running footsteps, the distinctive sound of weapons being drawn. But Min-jae had planned for this. His people knew the layout, had night vision, had been preparing for this moment for days. When the emergency lighting kicked in 30 seconds later, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Sophia and her team had positioned themselves strategically, and suddenly the Kozlovs found themselves surrounded. "Here's my counteroffer," Min-jae said calmly. "You leave. Tonight. You don't come back, you don't contact me, my people, or anyone connected to me ever again." "And if we refuse," Renee demanded, "then you don't leave at all." The threat wasn't empty, and everyone in the room knew it. Min-jae had a reputation for following through on his promises, both good and bad. Victor looked around, calculating odds, exits, alternatives. Finally, he nodded to his brother. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Min-jae replied. "It is." As they filed out, Renee paused beside him. "You think this makes you free? You think you can just walk away from what you are?" "I think," Min-jae said quietly, "that what I am is changing." Alone in the warehouse, Min-jae pulled out his phone and booked a flight to Portland. It was time to tell Aaliyah the truth. All of it. Portland was raining when Min-jae's plane landed. He'd never been to the city before, but he found Aaliyah's sister's address easily enough. Mark had provided it reluctantly, with strict instructions not to make him regret the decision. The house was small, cozy, tucked into a neighborhood of tree-lined streets and front-yard gardens. Min-jae sat in his rental car for 10 minutes, watching rain streak down the windshield, trying to find the words for a conversation that would either save or destroy the best thing in his life. Finally, he got out and walked to the front door. Aaliyah answered on the second knock. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. When she saw him, her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief. "How did you—" she began. "Mark," Min-jae said simply. "May I come in?" Aaliyah hesitated, then stepped aside. "My sister's at work. We have the house to ourselves." The living room was warm, lived in. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, and children's toys were scattered across the coffee table. It was so different from Min-jae's sterile apartment that he felt like an intruder just standing there. "You came a long way," Aaliyah said, not sitting down. "I had to. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you from the beginning." "About your import-export business?" There was no anger in her voice, just exhaustion. "About who I am, who I was, and who I'm trying to become." Aaliyah finally sat, curling into the corner of the couch. "I'm listening." Min-jae remained standing, needing the distance to get through this. "My grandfather built an organization," he began. "Started as protection for Korean immigrants who couldn't get help from the police. It grew, evolved. By the time my father inherited it, it was something else entirely. Something illegal. Yes, and you inherited it from him. When I was 25, I didn't want it, but walking away would have meant war. People would have died." Aaliyah was quiet, processing. "So you stayed." "I stayed. But I've been changing things, slowly. Moving money into legitimate businesses, cutting ties with the worst elements. It's taken years, but we're almost clean. Almost. The woman at the restaurant, Renee, she was part of the old guard. She didn't like the changes I was making. She threatened you to get to me." Aaliyah's hands tightened in her lap. "What kind of threat?" "The kind I made sure she'll never be able to carry out," Min-jae said, his voice carrying an edge that made Aaliyah shiver. "What does that mean?" "It means she's gone. They're all gone. The people who would have hurt you to hurt me, they're no longer a factor." Aaliyah studied his face, seeing the controlled violence there, the protective fury he'd tried so hard to hide from her. "You killed them. I removed the threat, Min-jae said carefully, by whatever means necessary. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Finally, Aaliyah spoke. I researched you, she said quietly. After that night at the restaurant, I know what people say about you, what you're capable of. And I also know what you've been doing the past 3 years, the community centers you've funded, the scholarships, the legitimate businesses you've built that employ hundreds of people. Min-jae blinked, surprised. You know about that? I know about a lot of things, including the fact that you've been systematically dismantling your grandfather's empire and replacing it with something that actually helps people. Aaliyah, I also know, she continued, that you could have lied to me, could have hidden all of this forever. But you didn't. You're here telling me the truth, even though it might cost you everything. Min-jae felt something crack open in his chest. You're not running. I already tried that, Aaliyah said with a small smile. Turns out you can't run from your own heart. Even knowing what I am, what I've done? Aaliyah stood, crossing to him slowly. I know who you are, she said, reaching up to touch his face. You're the man who asked me one question when everyone else had already made up their minds. You're the man who listens when I talk, who remembers what matters to me. You're the man who spent 3 years trying to build something better from the ashes of something terrible. I'm also the man who put you in danger just by caring about you. And you're the man who eliminated that danger to keep me safe, Aaliyah replied. I'm not naive, Min-jae. I know the world isn't black and white. I know that sometimes good people have to make hard choices. Min-jae searched her eyes, looking for doubt, for fear, found only acceptance. Did he ever ask you who you are, or only what you looked like across a table? He said softly, echoing the question that had started everything. Aaliyah smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. You asked me who I was, and then you spent weeks learning the answer. I love you, Min-jae said, the words finally free. I love your strength, your kindness, your refusal to let the world make you small. I love the way you see people, really see them. I love who I am when I'm with you. I love you too, Aaliyah whispered. All of you, even the parts that scare me. When he kissed her, it tasted like rain and redemption, like coming home after a long journey through darkness. What happens now? Aaliyah asked against his lips. Now, Min-jae said, we build something new, together. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. Years later, Min-jae stood in the same restaurant where they'd first met, but this time the table was set for a celebration. The legitimate business empire he'd built was thriving, employing hundreds and supporting dozens of community programs. The old life was truly behind him now, buried so completely that most people had forgotten it ever existed. Aaliyah emerged from the restroom, radiant in the same navy dress she'd worn that first night, though now it stretched gently over the curve of her growing belly. 6 months along, and Min-jae still caught his breath every time he looked at her. Ready? She asked, taking his hand. For anything, he replied, meaning it. Their friends were waiting, Daniel and Mark, Sophia and Lucas, even Aaliyah's sister who'd flown in from Portland, a celebration of the community center they'd just opened together, funded by Min-jae's businesses and designed by Aaliyah's vision. As they walked to their table, Min-jae remembered that night when he'd watched a woman handle rejection with grace and decided to ask one simple question. The best decisions, he'd learned, often began with the smallest acts of courage, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, they led to everything. Thank you for staying until the end. Korean Mafia Lovers has many more passionate and unexpected romance stories waiting for you. Subscribe to the channel and help us create more incredible love stories like this one.